Hello, and welcome back to Library Ladies. In today's episode, we will be discussing the chapter Field Trip from the bestseller, The Things They Carry by Tim O'Brien. Today I have with me Library Lady Emma, Library Lady Dana, and Honorary Library Lady Tim O'Brien.
Hello, I'm so excited about our topic today.
Yes, and I'm so excited for our special guest.
Wow, I'm honored to be a library lady and to hear your interpretations of my work, and perhaps give a few interpretations of my own.
Well, we are honored you are here today. Today we will be discussing different ideas for the chapter.
Yeah, a very interesting chapter, don't you think?
Yeah, I totally agree, Emma.
Definitely, there are absolutely some big ideas that are worth talking about.
I completely agree. Oh, Brian, why don't we start out with you just explaining exactly what happens in the chapter and describing the situation?
Of course. So I wrote a chapter called Field Trip, and in it I take my fictional daughter Kathleen to Vietnam as a birthday gift. We go and we do some of the touristy things there, but the biggest thing we do, at least for my character, Tim O'Brien, is visit the field where my best friend Kiowa died.
And this is a rather large step for him, right? I mean, he has not been to the war in 20 years.
I agree. He goes back to the field where Kiowa dies and is astonished by how much it has changed. He describes a bright August sun and a white blue sky, and says he gazes at the field, which implies admiration.
I can see how you'd believe that. This change in environment, I think, has a lot to do with the time that has passed. The land has been restored and O'Brien does not see the same field that he once experienced. The diction used to describe the field is now sentimental sounding and has a tone of fondness. This word usage contrasts greatly from in the field, when the field is a cold and dark place that smells of rotted fish and is called the shit field. He now called it a piece of ground and says that it is too ordinary.
Exactly, library ladies. The title of the chapter, Field Trip, is a pun that plays with the idea of it being childish and calling it a field trip, but also has a literal meaning of visiting this particular field. The field, I think, is a character in itself in my novel in a way. My character has an emotional relationship with it, holds blame for it taking away the person he had become. He says the field embodied the waste of the war.
This restorative effect that happens to this field, is it the only thing that is restored in the chapter? I feel like this is a recurring theme.
Absolutely. That theme is important to understanding the true meaning of the chapter.
Okay, let's talk about it.
I think that one really cool thing is how in this chapter there's a theme of how time has a restorative effect on history and how as time passes, a person's connection to history drastically changes.
I agree, Emma. I think that this idea of time as a restorative effect on history is very prevalent through the farmer that O'Brien encounters in the field. I think that the farmer serves as a symbol of the country of Vietnam and the war itself. When the farmer picked up a shovel and raised it over his head and held it there for a time, grimly, like a flag, it is a sign of peace and harmony between the war and O'Brien.
I agree, Dana. I think that the moment between the farmer and O'Brien could be seen as a sign of peace because during the war, if O'Brien had seen a Vietnamese man, especially in this field, he would have had to kill him. But when he saw him in the field 20 years later, they could just acknowledge each other and move on with their separate lives.
Library ladies, I am very glad that you brought this idea of time as a healing effect on history because it was definitely something that I was trying to convey through this chapter. I expressed this idea through the farmer, but also through Kathleen. Through Kathleen, I was showing how just 20 years could change a person's whole perspective on a place in history in general. The field and Vietnam had just had such a negative memory for O'Brien, but his daughter, the next generation, had no attachment to the field or Vietnam at all. For her, it was just something that they were going to learn about in school.
Wow, that's very interesting. I had never thought of that before. But I can see where you did this when you said, frowning, she squinted out at the field for a second, then shrugged and walked back to the Jeep. Here you really showed how the field had no sentimental value or any value at all to Kathleen. But when you said, and besides, I had business here, you're showing that the attachment that O'Brien had with the field.
Those are all very good points, library ladies. Have you guys thought about the generational gap between O'Brien and Kathleen? When the chapter says that the war was a remote to her as dinosaurs and cavemen, this really illustrates the foreignness of the war to Kathleen. This, along with her pure lack of interest to gain knowledge, shows the generational gap between her and O'Brien because war is a real-life thing for O'Brien when it's just an idea for Kathleen.
I think to go along with Kathleen's lack of interest, as time goes on, the relationship between the countries that were once at war become healed. Because the relationships between these countries begin to heal, people see less and less of a need to have negative emotions towards a place.
That is a really cool idea about how Kathleen shows a generational gap. Do you think that Kathleen and the government interpreter also symbolize this theme in some way?
Absolutely.
I definitely think that the relationship between Kathleen and the interpreter could symbolize this theme. I think that the interpreter represents modern day, and the fact that Kathleen becomes such good friends with him so fast shows that Kathleen is more interested in present day rather than the past.
Great point, Cora. I think that the idea that Kathleen is more interested in present day rather than the past just goes again to show how time has an effect on the way that people view history.
Oh, to go alongside that, I also think that it's important to note that O'Brien doesn't pay any attention to the interpreter other than to acknowledge that Kathleen and him had become fast friends. I think that this goes to show that O'Brien is still somewhat living in the past and that he has more of an understanding and respect for the field in Vietnam as a whole.
Another interesting idea is that throughout the things they carried, Tim O'Brien makes it evident that the war left many with psychological dilemmas about how to cope with their memories. In this chapter, I think that Tim could be making a comment about how time can affect people psychologically. Let's take a look at an excerpt from pages 175 and 176.
From the start, I'd wanted to take my daughter to the places I'd seen as a soldier. I wanted to show her the Vietnam that kept me awake at night. It seemed appropriate, and besides, I had business there.
Perhaps he intuitively felt a need to go back for something. He said that he had business there, but what could the business be other than showing Kathleen the world? The word choice of business implies necessity, so could this mean that there was a psychological need to go back?
Even if the trip simply was for the sake of tourism, the mention of the Vietnam that kept him awake at night shows that the memories of Vietnam created psychological unrest and put O'Brien in quite the dilemma to learn how to deal with the past.
That brings us to the next quotation on page 178 that describes what O'Brien did once he arrived at the field where Kiowa died.
I eased myself down, squatting at first, then sitting. There was again that sense of recognition. The water rose to my chest, a deep greenish brown, almost hot. For a few moments I could not bring myself to move, like walking away from a summer nap, feeling lazy and sluggish, the world collecting itself around me.
An archetype in literature is that most submersions underwater indicate some sort of baptism or rebirth of a character. Even though there was no religious connection and the water is quite dirty, the puddle of water in the field can stand in for a psychological baptismal pool.
The word choice waking up can stand for both physical action and mental realization. In this sense, the physical and mental state could mirror each other where disoriented satisfaction is found, similar to the end of a summer nap.
In addition, the phrase, the world collecting itself around me, gives the impression that there is a world to rediscover from the changes that have occurred. The collection of the world could indicate the reassembly of perception, suggesting an interchange as the world did not literally change.
I think that there could be also proof of this change. Let's refer back to page 179, where O'Brien holds eye contact with an elderly Vietnamese man after his swim.
As we stared at each other, neither of us moving, I felt something go shut in my heart while something else swung open.
When he says, something goes shut, I think that it could indicate the end of something, particularly the mental unrest in his memories. O'Brien could be using the imagery of the door to show shutting of the turmoil associated to his war memories.
By saying something else swung open, the reader gets a vision of an open door suggesting new beginnings. It's also notable that O'Brien never specifies what something is, so we can infer that he is speaking of an intangible change.
One last important aspect of this quotation is that neither of them were moving. There was no action that caused a change in understanding between the Vietnamese man and O'Brien, but instead the change must have been caused by time. After such a long duration, two former enemies were able to find peace, but only needed the time to get there. Overall, I think that O'Brien is suggesting that the time has the ability to heal psychological dilemmas when action fails.
I agree. Amazing point, Dana. Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode.
Thanks to our special guest, Tim O'Brien, for providing his input.
Thank you, library ladies, for having me today.
We hope you guys will join us again next week for our interpretation of the ghost soldiers. See you soon!
See you next week.